The Copper Scroll is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1952 in Cave 3 near Qumran. Unlike the others, it was engraved on copper rather than written on parchment. This implies a different purpose, while the limitation is uncertainty about why this material was chosen. The scroll lists locations of buried gold and silver, described in precise quantities. This implies an inventory rather than a religious text. The limitation is that the listed measurements and locations are difficult to interpret. Copper was an unusual medium for writing in antiquity. This implies an intent for durability. The limitation is that engraving makes corrections impossible, suggesting high confidence or finality. The text was too brittle to unroll and had to be cut into sections. This implies preservation challenges. The limitation is that cutting risked loss of information. Unlike other Dead Sea Scrolls, the Copper Scroll is written in a form of Hebrew closer to spoken language. This implies practical use. The limitation is ambiguity about authorship. The scroll references dozens of hidden caches containing precious metals. This implies real assets. The limitation is that none have been conclusively recovered. Quantities listed are extremely large, totaling tons of metal. This implies substantial wealth. The limitation is skepticism about whether such amounts could realistically exist. The locations are described using landmarks that no longer exist. This implies historical change. The limitation is inability to map descriptions accurately. Scholars debate whether the scroll refers to actual treasure or symbolic deposits. This implies interpretive divergence. The limitation is lack of corroborating texts. The scroll does not explain who hid the treasure or why. This implies secrecy. The limitation is absence of contextual narrative. Some researchers link the scroll to the Second Temple period. This implies a connection to Jerusalem's temple wealth. The limitation is that the scroll was not found in Jerusalem. The Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE provides historical context for hiding valuables. This implies motive. The limitation is temporal uncertainty of the scroll's creation. Linguistic analysis suggests multiple scribes or stages of composition. This implies collaborative effort. The limitation is that engraving style limits certainty. The scroll lists specific measurements using ancient units. This implies technical precision. The limitation is uncertainty in converting those units to modern values. The Copper Scroll differs in tone from sectarian Qumran texts. This implies it may not belong to the same community. The limitation is proximity of discovery influencing assumptions. Some locations appear to reference water sources or tunnels. This implies concealment strategies. The limitation is altered landscapes. Archaeological searches based on the scroll have been conducted. This implies testability. The limitation is that none have produced definitive results. The scroll contains no religious doctrine or moral instruction. This implies functional intent. The limitation is rarity of such documents. The use of copper suggests expectation of long-term concealment. This implies planning for future recovery. The limitation is that no recovery occurred. Scholars question whether the scroll was a copy of an earlier document. This implies transmission. The limitation is absence of originals. The scroll's discovery among religious texts complicates classification. This implies mixed context. The limitation is association by location alone. Some argue the scroll was intended for insiders familiar with the landscape. This implies restricted knowledge. The limitation is loss of that knowledge. The precision of directions contrasts with the inability to locate sites today. This implies contextual dependency. The limitation is temporal displacement. Metallurgical analysis confirms the copper alloy dates to antiquity. This supports authenticity. The limitation is that authenticity does not confirm accuracy. The scroll has been translated multiple times with varying interpretations. This implies linguistic ambiguity. The limitation is translation uncertainty. The absence of accompanying maps complicates use. This implies reliance on memory. The limitation is isolation of the text. Some scholars suggest the scroll lists temple treasures hidden before Roman conquest. This implies historical urgency. The limitation is lack of independent confirmation. Others propose it describes a symbolic inventory rather than physical caches. This implies metaphor. The limitation is speculative interpretation. No mention of recovery instructions appears in the text. This implies incomplete documentation. The limitation is missing procedural context. At this contextual stage, the Copper Scroll stands as a unique ancient document describing hidden wealth without verifiable recovery. The implication is unresolved intent, while the limitation remains clear. The text cannot be tested conclusively. Continued study of the Copper Scroll has focused on whether its contents describe a real, centralized treasury or multiple dispersed deposits. This implies organized concealment. The limitation is that the text provides no overarching explanation, linking the listed caches into a single system. Some scholars argue the quantities listed exceed what is known of local economic capacity. This implies exaggeration or symbolic accounting. The limitation is uncertainty about ancient wealth accumulation and reporting practices. The scroll's references to gold and silver use technical terminology rather than religious language. This suggests administrative intent. The limitation is that technical language alone does not confirm practical usability. Comparisons with other Second Temple period texts show no parallel documents listing hidden treasure. This implies uniqueness. The limitation is that unique documents are difficult to contextualize. The Copper Scroll's directions often rely on relative distances rather than fixed coordinates. This implies local knowledge. The limitation is that such knowledge was not preserved. Archaeological teams have attempted to match descriptions with known sites around Jerusalem and the Judean desert. This implies investigative testing. The limitation is that landscape modification over 2 millennia obscures correlations. Some locations described appear to reference subterranean spaces. This implies use of tunnels or chambers. The limitation is that many ancient tunnels remain inaccessible or undiscovered. The scroll does not mention defensive measures or traps. This implies reliance on secrecy rather than protection. The limitation is that absence of mention does not confirm absence of measures. Linguistic analysis indicates the Hebrew used is non-literary and utilitarian. This supports functional interpretation. The limitation is that functional style does not guarantee factual accuracy. Debate continues over whether the scroll was intended as a working document or a ceremonial record. This implies dual possibilities. The limitation is lack of contextual clues. The scroll's discovery location raises questions about why a treasure list would be stored with religious manuscripts. This implies convergence of communities. The limitation is assuming shared authorship. Some researchers propose the scroll was brought to Qumran for safekeeping during crisis. This implies urgency. The limitation is absence of supporting documentation. The Roman campaign in Judea involved systematic confiscation of wealth. This supports a motive for concealment. The limitation is linking specific events to the scroll. No Roman records mention the recovery of such large hidden treasuries. This absence implies concealment success or non-existence. The limitation is incomplete Roman documentation. The scroll's lack of narrative context forces interpretation to rely on external history. This implies reconstruction. The limitation is inferential dependency. Scholars disagree on whether the treasure described could still exist. This implies ongoing relevance. The limitation is lack of recoveries after extensive searching. Some argue the scroll is a theoretical inventory compiled before concealment. This implies planning rather than execution. The limitation is no indication of subsequent action. The precise listing of weights suggests accountability. This implies record keeping. The limitation is absence of confirmation that deposits matched records. The Copper Scroll's survival contrasts with the loss of any associated explanatory texts. This implies selective preservation. The limitation is fragmented evidence. Modern translations vary in interpreting key terms related to location and containers. This implies semantic ambiguity. The limitation is linguistic uncertainty. The scroll's material durability ensured survival, but its content remained opaque. This highlights a paradox. The limitation is durable medium without durable meaning. Some scholars interpret the scroll as a symbolic assertion of hidden sacred wealth. This implies ideological purpose. The limitation is speculative reading. Archaeological methodology favors corroboration through material finds. The copper scroll resists this approach. The limitation is methodological mismatch. The scroll's existence challenges assumptions about the Dead Sea Scrolls as purely religious. This broadens understanding. The limitation is categorization difficulty. No consensus exists on the scroll's authoring group. This complicates attribution. The limitation is absence of identifiers. The copper scroll remains the only known ancient text engraved to preserve a treasure list. This uniqueness sustains debate. The limitation is lack of comparative cases. Modern technology has improved imaging of inscriptions, but not interpretation. This highlights limits of tools. The limitation is contextual loss. Some researchers suggest the treasure was recovered in antiquity, rendering the list obsolete. This implies historical closure. The limitation is no record of recovery. Others argue the scroll represents wealth never retrieved. This implies enduring mystery. The limitation is absence of proof. At this investigative stage, the copper scroll continues to resist classification as factual inventory or symbolic record. The implication is unresolved purpose, while the limitation remains. Without discovery of any cache, conclusions remain provisional. The copper scroll's unresolved status has led scholars to reconsider assumptions about ancient documentation practices. This implies flexibility in record keeping. The limitation is that modern expectations of clarity may not apply to ancient crisis contexts. Comparisons with later medieval treasure lists show similar reliance on local landmarks. This suggests a practical tradition. The limitation is that medieval parallels do not confirm ancient intent. The scroll's silence on ownership raises questions about who controlled the listed wealth. This implies collective or institutional possession. The limitation is lack of identifying markers. Some interpretations suggest the list was meant for a future generation. This implies delayed recovery. The limitation is absence of time indicators. The scale of the treasure has fueled skepticism about literal interpretation. This implies exaggeration. The limitation is incomplete knowledge of Second Temple resources. Archaeological failures to locate any cache have shaped modern skepticism. This implies negative evidence. The limitation is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The scroll's detailed directions contrast with their modern uselessness. This implies dependence on a vanished landscape. The limitation is irreversible environmental change. Some scholars argue the text reflects administrative fragmentation during crisis. This implies hurried compilation. The limitation is interpretive speculation. The copper scroll challenges the boundary between archive and instruction manual. This blurs genre classification. The limitation is categorical ambiguity. Advances in geospatial modeling have been applied to the scroll's locations. This suggests methodological innovation. The limitation is speculative correlation. The document's durability contrasts with the fragility of its meaning. This highlights historical irony. The limitation is philosophical framing. Debate continues over whether the scroll was ever meant to be acted upon. This implies symbolic intent. The limitation is lack of corroboration. The scroll's presence among religious manuscripts complicates interpretation. This suggests coexistence of sacred and practical texts. The limitation is contextual assumption. Scholars emphasize caution against literal treasure hunting interpretations. This reflects academic restraint. The limitation is public expectation. The copper scroll remains central to discussions about hidden wealth in antiquity. This sustains interest. The limitation is repetitive inquiry. The lack of accompanying maps or diagrams remains a critical obstacle. This limits application. The limitation is missing supporting materials. Interpretations increasingly focus on what the scroll reveals about fear and loss during crisis. This reframes significance. The limitation is psychological inference. The document illustrates how information can survive while meaning disappears. This defines its mystery. The limitation is irreversible loss. Without discovery of any cache, evaluation remains theoretical. This constrains conclusions. The limitation is empirical failure. The copper scroll has influenced modern imagination more than archaeological practice. This shapes perception. The limitation is cultural bias. The text continues to be studied for linguistic and historical insight rather than treasure. This shifts purpose. The limitation is unmet original function. The scroll's uniqueness ensures ongoing debate despite limited progress. This sustains relevance. The limitation is diminishing returns. Scholars accept that the scroll may never be fully understood. This reflects methodological humility. The limitation is acceptance of uncertainty. The copper scroll demonstrates the limits of textual evidence without material confirmation. This informs archaeology broadly. The limitation is evidentiary imbalance. The mystery persists not because of hidden clues, but because context is lost. This defines the case. The limitation is finality. The scroll stands as a reminder that documentation does not guarantee recovery. This has broader implications. The limitation is generalization. Each proposed explanation resolves some questions while raising others. This sustains debate. The limitation is partial explanation. The copper scroll remains unresolved despite decades of study. This underscores its status. The limitation is absence of closure. The document's significance lies in what it promises, but does not deliver. This frames interpretation. The limitation is interpretive tension. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.